Well, welcome back. Did you have a good lunch? Well, those of you who are still fasting, maybe you can bag some food for dinner tonight. It's great to have you all back, and we're looking forward to a packed afternoon of several new presenters. But before we dive into that, I want to introduce a musical item by Sandra Interman. Please put your hands together and welcome her.
I really needed you, more than a friend, someone I could talk to. You've changed me in so many ways. Nobody knows me like you. You put your arms around me, you bring me through. And there's many times I don't know what to do. Though some know me well, still nobody knows me like you. To you I tell. You saw each time that I slipped and fell, and all of my faults, yes, you know them well, but you never turned me away. Nobody knows me like you. You put your arms around me, you bring me through. And there's many times I don't know what to do. Though some know me well, still nobody knows me like you. Walking in your presence is where I want to be. You said in your word, you said that you would lead me. Yes, I love you. Oh, I really love you. I'll go anywhere as long as I know you'll be there. Those nights that I was afraid, I stood on the promises you had made. The way that I act, sometimes I am ashamed, but you never turned me away. No, 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 nobody knows me like you. You put your arms around me, you bring me through. And there's many times I don't know what to do. Though some know me well, still nobody knows me like you. Nobody knows me like you. You put your arms around me, you bring me through. And there's many times I don't know what to do. Though some know me well, still nobody knows me like you. Though some know me well, still nobody knows me like you. Though some know me well, still nobody knows me like you.
Our next speaker is a celebrated athlete, having won gold medals in the Australian and Pan-Pacific Powerlifting Championships. His extraordinary story of leaving gang life and eventually pursuing God, coupled with his passion for health and fitness and God's plans for the world, have made him a sought-after speaker throughout the South Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rome Yulia.
It's 1970s. My parents had just moved over to the islands, from the islands to New Zealand. the factories had just opened up. A newspaper article went to the island saying, "Come to the land flowing with milk and honey." Many Polynesians came to New Zealand during that time, not just for themselves, but they were coming so that they could set up a life, not just for themselves, but also for their children. As a Polynesian growing up in New Zealand, I didn't really know that history, didn't really ask or cared about that history. But Mom came from a very humble family, a Christian family. My dad, on the other hand, wasn't so much of a person that was really into the whole Christian thing. My dad was kind of like, he was living life on the fast lane, and he came from a family that was really well off. And so my grandmother used to always talk to my mother about making sure that she doesn't meet somebody that was outside of the Christian faith, because it would make it very difficult for her to kind of maintain her faith while being in a relationship with someone that wasn't part of her faith. So part of the strategy was from my grandmother was to kind of get my mother on a plane and send her off to New Zealand. And so she went to New Zealand. She was only in her early 20s. And she met my father in the islands, but my father would follow suit. And he thought that it's like, the islands, you can land anywhere in New Zealand and just ask anybody and you'll be able to find someone. My mother was in Auckland and Dad landed in the south part of the North Island. And it took him a few weeks to finally find her. And when he did, she was a PIC Sunday school teacher in Auckland. And my mother describes that moment. It was like Dad and his friends had just stepped out of a pub. And Dad makes his way over to my mother and proposes to her there. They get married, and my mother found out quickly why my grandmother encouraged her to kind of find somebody that shares your faith, because you're gonna go through a lot of struggles in your relationship. And she did. She was a person that wasn't able to kind of practice her faith during that time, because my dad was his way or the highway. And my dad was the sort of person that, he'll talk to us once, and then the next time it's the hose or the broomstick or the nearest object that was next to you that will come flying your way. So we were always on our toes when it came to our father. But he would never talk to you about things that he was proud of you about. He would never tell you that he was proud of you for anything that you have accomplished or achieved. And so my parents were struggling to kind of find themselves in this new place called New Zealand. They couldn't speak English. They didn't understand English. They couldn't even read English. So when I was going to school, I'd come home and I'd have work that I needed to do, and I needed my parents' help. It was difficult for me to be able to do that. And so eventually I was one of those that just absolutely hated school. I failed in school miserably. And from my dad, I had this distaste as well for religion. I had this distaste for education. So I knew I hated two things growing up. I hated religion and I hated school. Eventually, I'd attend a school called Kelston where everything changed for me. In Kelston, I knew that I wasn't going to be good at school, and I was eventually kicked out of school. And I immediately joined gangs and got involved with that life of drugs and alcohol. Got locked up twice. And I remember a time when I was really confused about who I was as a person. There were times when I was contemplating suicide because I didn't know who I was, and I was really frustrated with life. And no matter what I was doing or where I was, whether that place could be in a club or having a good time with my mates, there was still this kind of dark place within my own heart and mind. I couldn't really find myself, and I was really angry about that. I remember a moment when I get a phone call from a girl that I was in a relationship with, and one day she tells me that she was she was having a baby. And I remember when she told me that, I knew that I wasn't going to be a good father. And so I told her that, listen, we're going to have to get rid of it. We'll make an appointment, and we'll just get rid of the baby. And I remember her saying to me, just nodding her head. She was a bit confused, but at the same time, she just kind of went with it. And I remember that time clearly because when we made the appointment that we were going to get rid of the baby, everything was already set up. We went through the counseling sessions and everything. And then on the day that we were supposed to go through with the procedures, I waited all day. And the time ticked right past our appointment time. And I remember ringing her phone and leaving a really nasty message on the phone message. And I said, that's it. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. The next few months, I get a phone call saying, Rome, I just want you to know that you had a baby boy today. And I was in a place where I was really kind of thinking, like, should I turn up? Should I go and see? And eventually I came to myself and I said, let's go. So I went with a few of my mates and we went to Waitakere Hospital. And when we went there, I remember just waiting to try and kind of think, what am I going to say? Prepare myself for this boy that I was about to meet. And when I walked into the hospital that day, I still remember his face, his fingers. And I couldn't take my eyes off him because I remember telling my boys that I was only going to just be in and out, and that's it. And what was supposed to be an in and out moment ended up being a 2.5 hour moment. I sat there just looking at the boy, and all of a sudden, I felt like there's some meaning to my life now. I felt like I had a purpose now. And it was a crazy feeling, like I was in love, and I was just looking at this boy, and I remember telling his mother that I was going to be there for him no matter what. And I was going to turn up. I couldn't wait. I was excited to see him again the following day. I finally had something to be excited about. I was so excited about that. And I remember turning up every day just to see the boy. But my life was a mess, and she couldn't be around somebody like me. And I had to kind of escape because there was just this darkness that I couldn't explain that was in my life. There were so many things that was holding me down from really enjoying my life. I realized that the same patterns I had in my life was the same patterns that my brother had in his life and my father had in his life. And the reasons that we join gangs and do all these things is because we're trying to find some sort of meaning for life. And my father struggled in his relationship with us because he was still trying to identify who he was in this new place. My dad was a person that hated religion. He was driving to work one day. He had 2 items in the car. He had a beer crate and a potato sack, about 20 kgs. When his car broke down, he only had one choice of the 2 items to take to the nearest bus stop to get home. He took the beer crate, took it to the nearest bus stop, and he sat on that beer crate waiting for the bus. And then there was the sound of music coming from behind the bus stop. And then he heard the voice of a preacher preaching an evangelistic series. I could just see my dad just cringing as he's sitting there in front of that bus stop, just waiting for his bus to finally get there so he could just disappear. But as he was waiting for his bus didn't turn up for another 15, 20 minutes. And when his bus finally turned up, he let the bus go. And he sat there. Preacher went on. As soon as the preacher had finished, he jumped on the next bus and he went home. My mother was thinking, where's he been all night? Following day, he goes to work and his boss says, I heard your car broke down, I'll take you home. He said, no, it's fine. I'll go catch the bus. Back at the bus stop, sitting there, listening. That evangelistic campaign went on for about 3 weeks. Dad sat there and listened to the preacher. And at the end of listening to everything the preacher had to say at the end of the week, Dad made a decision right there and then. when he made a call for those who want to be baptized and give their life over to Jesus, he walked in from outside with his arms wide open, walking into the building, and he gave his life right then and there. He went home, and my mother was like shocked at the fact that he had made this decision, because he went home and went straight to the fridge and pulled out all the alcohol that he put there, and he started pouring it out. My mother came and joined, and they had this moment where they were both pouring alcohol out. Dad said, today I make a change. Every court case that my brother and I went to, Dad would never come. He'd never turn up. My brother was in one of the most difficult court cases of his life. And my mother would be the only person to turn up to all our court cases. She'll turn up faithfully. We'll have gang members there, and then there's just Mom sitting there. But she'll be sitting there praying, you know. And I remember when I was in court looking at my mother and she was praying, I couldn't help but get frustrated, because I was thinking, woman, you've been praying for years. And I don't know whether to feel sorry for you to get angry, but you keep praying and nothing changes. This is who we are. My brother describes this. He says he's sitting there looking at Mom, because Mom walked in, and she didn't walk in by herself. She walked in with my dad. And then some church folk turn up. And my brother says, man, you should have seen them walking in, man. They were like soldiers. Just walking in, you know. They sat down, and they were all praying together. And at a time when Dad was not supposed to stand up, he stood up unannounced. And the judge didn't hold him back. And in a nutshell, my dad says, my son's failure is not his alone. Not asking you to give my son a second chance. I'm asking you to give a father a second chance. Judge couldn't make a decision. She said, you know, we have to do this next week. Come the following week, my brother was released with bail conditions. And he said, you know what? I prayed, and one of the things I prayed about was I was going to give my life to God if he got me out of this situation. And by the grace of God, he's got me out of this situation. I'm jumping on a plane, and I'm going to Australia. And I remember during that time, I was really trying to find a way to escape my darkness. And I remember just thinking that I was always going to be the person that I was. Just before you earn your colors back in Kelston, you got to bleed for them. And when you bleed for it, you die for it. There's no way out. For me, I wanted out. I wanted something else. I was desperate for change. There was a time for me where I was just like true blue New Zealander all the way. And whenever anybody spoke to me about Australia, I'd say, I'd never go to Australia, ever. But I was desperate for change. I was desperate for change. And I remember ringing up my brother, and I was trying to find out where he was. And when I finally rung him, I got through to him. I said, where are you? And of all places, I was thinking maybe in Sydney, he could be in Melbourne, or maybe he's in Perth, or Brisbane, I don't know. I asked him, where are you? He said, I'm in Currumbong. Curran what? I'm in Currumbong. And my brother didn't believe me, because he knew what sort of person I was. When I said to him, I'm coming to find you, give me the address. And my brother gave me the address, and he says, oh, yep, okay, whatever. I'll see you when you get here. I purchased my ticket, and I got ready to leave. And I jumped on a plane, and I remember just saying goodbye to New Zealand and goodbye for good. Well, I finally get to my brother's house. He was living there with his family, his wife and 2 kids, and they had a humble home. Everything was different. I said to my brother, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? This place, I mean, like, look at it. It's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre area. It's in the middle of nowhere. But keep in mind, this is Currumbong back in 2005. I mean, Currumbong today, you know, with Morris said, you know, they're spoiled with the plaza there and all the others, those of you who are familiar with that place. We didn't have that when we were there. I mean, when I swore, when I looked at Morris for the first time, I felt like I just stepped into the 20th century. The only thing that was flashing with lights was Bilo. Eventually, my brother said to me, you know, you've got to just stay focused here and just find something to do and be active. You know what? I could not free myself from my own suffering in my own mind. But every time I looked at my brother in this unknown place, in this small unit, I couldn't, for the life of me, wonder, why is he happy? Why is he not worried about it? Why is he not thinking about escaping this place? You know, I stayed with him. I ended up working. And after working there, I decided that I was going to try and connect with my son and his mother. I wanted to find them, and eventually I did. But I had to go back to New Zealand to get them. 2006, I went back to New Zealand, and I came back to Australia quickly because I didn't want to be in New Zealand too long. I just wanted in and out. Just get there and leave. When I got married in New Zealand, my wife and my son, we came back and we found a place in Newcastle where we could just start life again. My relationship with my father was still broken, you see. And it wasn't until my father got in contact with me and he said to me, son, I want to come and spend some time with you. I'll go pick him up from Sydney. He came and we spent time together. Started sharing to me. And he opened up about so many struggles that he went through in his life. Both of us had this moment where we were just talking and sharing our hearts. We laid our hearts on the table. Throughout my whole life, I've never had that conversation with my father. We never had that sort of relationship. And now for the first time in my life, we've got this relationship. And we spent every day together for the next 3 months. And it was good having my son there as well. Still, there was this place in my mind that I couldn't escape. When Dad left, we're at the airport. And he looks to me and he says to me, son, because I kept on asking him, is there anything I can do to make up for lost time? He kind of looked at me and he said, I don't want you to, I need your money, I don't need anything, but if you could do one thing for me, that young boy that saved your life, I want you to do a full circle and just turn your life towards God. If you can establish a relationship with God, that's all I need. Dad went home, I went back, and I decided, you know what? That's it. If my dad can be transformed by that book and the person of Jesus Christ, I need to find out who he is for myself. Yeah, I had a picture of who Jesus was, but I didn't really know him for myself. So I remember looking for a Bible at home, and I came across a Good News Bible. It was awesome because it had like pictures in it. And as I was looking through the book, I started reading, and I decided I'll start in Genesis. And I'm not going to move a single verse until I understand the verse that I just read. And as I was reading through the book, I was going through Genesis, struggled through Exodus, and eventually died in Leviticus. I said, I don't even know what I just read. I remember ringing out my wife, and I said to her, hey, can you find out whether there's a nearby library somewhere around here so I can just kind of look up some of these places, kind of find out where I can get some help in understanding this book? And so she tells me there was a Catholic library down the road that I should go and check out. So I did. Those guys taught me how to use commentaries and concordances. And I started looking through the Bible again, and now I'm studying through it word by word. Then I had these Avondale College students turn up to my house. And we were going back and forth. And as I was reading, I discovered, hey, the two things I hated more than anything, school and religion. Now I'm studying religion. And I tell you, the number one thing I hated more than anything was reading. And now I've just looked at all the books I was reading. I couldn't believe I just read William Durant and Edward Gibbons. And I was like reading all this history. And I said, I didn't even know that existed in me. I couldn't put books down. I needed to read and find out more because I needed to find out for myself. And as I was putting two and two together, from what the Word of God said, I came across the book of Daniel. And when I was in Daniel in 2007. It's 2017 today. I've not put the book down. I've been through and through the book of Daniel, looking at the prophecies of the book of Daniel, and I was flipping right through the pages, reading up on what other commentators thought about some of the events. And it was about between 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember waking up my wife, and I said to her, "Have you read this? Daniel chapter 9. Have you seen it? I kid you not, you have to look at this." My wife was like, "Okay." I started drawing up graphs, and I was doing, you know what? You would have thought my room was the room of a madman. With all these timelines on the floor and pages, I was scribbling through things. I couldn't stop. I couldn't move away from the book. And I knew then God was calling me for something greater than myself. You know, it's interesting. I went to college, and I signed up to study. And I was sitting there my first day at college. I was trying to get my brain to function. I've been out of school since I was 15, and I was reading, and I couldn't do it. Started leaning on God for the first time again, and I said, "God, you're going to have to help me get through this." And I struggled to do it, but I didn't give up on Him. And I know that He didn't give up on me. On my second year, my mother hears from a relative that there's a speaker in Sydney with your last name. Last thing my mom remembers of me was I was locked up. Involved in so many different things, crazy things, and Mom rings me up and says, "Hey, I just found out that you're speaking somewhere in Sydney. I just want to know, what are you doing?" I didn't tell Mom what I was doing. I wanted to first graduate and then tell Mom what I've done. So I failed her all my life. I was hesitant to say something, but my wife said, "Just tell her." My mom on the phone, I said, "Mom, your boy's in college studying a Bachelor of Theology." She was like, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, it's my second year. I'm going to be going on to my third year soon." Quiet. She was just quiet. Then she said in my language, "Thank you, Jesus." After 20 plus years of prayer. You've answered. Thank you.
Well, that was amazing, huh? A little different from some of the other presenters. Rome, I want to invite you back out, and we've got a few questions for you.
Sure.
I'm a little nervous standing next to you. Is that okay? Because, yeah.
It's all good.
Why did you call your talk "Blood In, Blood Out"? Exactly.
When I first wrote my story down, I was thinking about that word, blood. Blood was thicker than water. My family was blood, but then at times family failed you. Then I found blood within gang life. There were guys that were involved in gangs that knew the meaning of loyalty more than those who were actually related to me. And I would often hear these sayings, "Rome, I'll die for you. I'll die for you. What does it mean to be a gangster? I'll die for you. I'll lay my life down for you." Wow. And I said the same thing back to them. Out of the 4 guys that we started this whole journey together through gang life, only 2 of us are alive today. And so the whole thing of like, "I'll die for you, I'll lay my life down for you." When I heard Jesus say those words, "I'll lay my life down for my friends," I thought, man, Christianity is the biggest gang I've ever seen.
That's awesome. What in your fathering now reflects what you have learned from your experience?
You know what? Because I grew up in a kind of a strict home, my father was just like so strict with everything. And there was a lot of violence at home as well. My wife, she's like, "Can you just be a little bit more hard on the kids?" And for me, because violence and aggression was around me growing up, and it was part of the reason I went down the wrong path, I want nothing to do with it. I don't even want to come near it. Like, I pull away from it so much that when my children have just worked my wife up the wall, she's like, do something. I'm like, you guys better listen to your mother, or I'll deal to you guys. And my daughter's the first one, you won't do that, Dad. And so they know me like that, so yeah.
That's good. What is your heaviest ever bench press, and what is your heaviest ever deadlift? And what is your fitness routine in a normal week?
The heaviest bench press is 200 kilos.
Wow, that's incredible.
That's in competition. I have benched 220 outside of competition. I have deadlifted 320 kilos. In competition, we were deadlifting 292.5, 300 kilos. Squatting 280, squatted 300. Training regime every week, squats, deadlifts, bench. I've incorporated snatch and the clean and jerk. So it's become a tool for ministry for me. In our community where I'm ministering, we've opened up our garage and created a gym in there where people can just come and train for free.
That's fantastic.
And we've built relationships there, and we've even started a church.
No
from
kidding.
that. So,
incredible. This is a little off script, Rome, but do you think if I opened up my garage and started lifting weights that people would come in and maybe I could start a church from that? You think?
I'm not sure. I mean, possibly.
Look at the difference in our arms. And I'm not a weakling. One more question. How was your relationship with your mom through all those tough years?
Mom's been my anchor. She's the one that she's been a prayer warrior for as long as I can remember. If I go back as far as I can remember, 3 years old, Mom prayed over me. That's one thing I can remember about Mom. My siblings, she was a woman of prayer. And I called her like the prayer assassinator. You know, she would like put somebody on her prayer list. And she put my brother on a prayer list, and my brother was baptized into the church. And she put my sister on a prayer list, my father on a prayer list, and I was the last one to be put on a prayer list, and here I am.
Amen. Isn't that awesome? Woo! Why don't you just thank Rome Yulia? He will be back actually tomorrow. We're looking forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you.
Bless you.
God bless.
Well, earlier today, our next speaker shared how archaeology forms the foundation of many of the Bible prophecies. And apart from speaking around the globe on all matters of subjects ranging from ancient history to meeting life's greatest challenges, Lyle serves as the lead pastor of a church in Maitland, New South Wales. In fact, you can enjoy a litany of presentations that he shared by simply typing his name into any internet search engine. And I just learned that he also hosts a breakfast show on Faith FM, which you can get online. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, will you please welcome Pastor Lyle Southwell.
Bible prophecy is full of symbols. Anybody who has looked into the prophecies of the Bible, particularly Daniel and Revelation, will recognize immediately that it is full of codes and symbols that need to be deciphered, and it's part of the challenge and the enjoyment of studying Bible prophecy is digging into them and finding out how the Bible actually decodes itself. Now, there are many things that we could talk about this afternoon, and we have already spoken about how that prophecy confirms the Bible. I want to take that a little bit further here as we work through this afternoon's subjects. And as we look at history's secret codes unearthed, we're going to look at 3 lines of investigation that establish the authority of the Bible for us. And so we find we have the supernatural origin of the Bible, and we particularly note that within the realm of prophecy. This morning we spoke about how that you can't tell me what's going to happen 490 years from now, but the Bible was able to do that, isn't that so? And so we find that the Bible has supernatural origins. We're also going to this afternoon look at the supernatural preservation of the Bible and finally the supernatural effect of the Bible, because without the presence of the supernatural, it is the presence of the supernatural that creates the existence of religion. Religion that doesn't exist. God doesn't exist without the supernatural. And so we need to find evidence for the supernatural as we look at the Bible and the codes and symbols contained within the Bible. Just a little bit of history very quickly, running through it. This is the history of our world as it's given in the Bible. And the Bible was written during this period here, a 1500-year period. And it looks kind of short compared to some of the other long time spans. But that basically gives us a picture of where the Bible fits in. One of the difficulties and one of the challenges that has been faced in the past with the trustworthiness of the Bible is the fact that it was written a long time ago and has been passed down through many centuries. And in the past, we had those who would study the Bible, and in their study of the Bible, they would note that our oldest manuscripts only really took us back about 1,000 years, and they wanted to know how many changes had taken place in the generations, the centuries, the millennia before that. You see, researchers noted that every ancient culture, as it passed on its information and its spirituality and its books and its myths and its legends and so forth, those myths and legends and history even would be changed over the centuries and sometimes changed quite dramatically. And so we can go to Egypt as an example, and Egypt probably is the most dramatic example because it seems the Egyptians didn't even try. As their gods got changed and adapted down through history, they just rolled with it rather than trying to sort it all out. But if we go to Egypt, we can find that the gods were combined with each other as easily as they were divided. A god could be called the Bar of Anara, or two or more deities could be joined into one god with a combined name and iconography. Local gods were linked with greater ones, and deities with similar functions were combined, and it became just a whole mixed up mess. Ra was connected with the local deity Sobek to form Sobek Ra, with Ammon to form Ammon Ra, with the solar form of Horus to form Ra Horokri. Also you had Horak, okay, don't even try and get me to pronounce this one right here, but I think you start to get the idea. Deities of different sexes were joined, producing combinations like Osiris Neith and Mun, and we could go on. The Greeks, on the other hand, they were a little bit more careful in how they tried to pass down their gods. They had a lot less gods to deal with, so it was a lot easier. But even their gods got mixed up, their Olympians and Titans, as they were passed down through the generations. And so if we consider Aphrodite, for example, in 760 BC, she is identified as the daughter of Zeus and Dione by Homer, but 100 years later, she is the daughter of Cronus and Uranus. That was by Hesiod. And then, of course, Plato comes along and tries to solve the problem by saying, oh, no, there is actually two different Aphrodites. And so you see the problem. And this is just two small samples. And so researchers wanted to know how much of this has taken place in the Bible. How much of the Bible has been changed? Are we reading the Bible that has always existed? Or is it vastly different now that it has been passed down through many generations? And of course, when they're reading these Greek documents here, they are reading very, very old documents that are much closer to the original than the copies of the Bible they had. Well, that all changed when the greatest archaeological discovery of all time was made in the region of the Dead Sea. And we're all familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth and the saltiest water on earth. The Dead Sea is a place where you just can't sink. You just bob to the surface. And when I was there, I even tried to tread water, and it was really hard to tread water because your feet would try and pop up. And it was a really bad thing if they popped up this way because it would plant your face in the middle of it, and you really didn't want to put your face in it. But it was here in 1947 that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, hiding in a cave near the remains of a village called Qumran. And here you have Qumran. These were Essenes that were living here. And part of their work had been to copy down copies of the scriptures. Now, there were many other books that were contained amongst that as well. This was a real treasure trove of ancient documents. But the ones that have fascinated researchers the most are those scrolls that contain portions of the Bible. You see, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they took our knowledge of Scripture 1,000 years closer in the Old Testament to the original. And of course, researchers were very quick to say, okay, let's have a look at these and let's read through them. Let's find out over a 1,000-year gap how many changes have taken place. And of course, they were expecting changes to have taken place, somewhere between the level of the Greeks and the Egyptians, and for those ancient manuscripts to be vastly different from the ones that we have today. And of course, this would end up being, quite an embarrassment for Christianity that has placed so much faith in the Bible. Well, researchers were absolutely stunned and shocked to find that when they read through those Dead Sea Scrolls, the copies of the ancient Old Testament, that they were almost word for word the Bible that we have right here. And so that then created a major problem. You see, with something like that, you then have to explain, how did that happen? That has never happened with any other ancient document, regardless of how determined the copiers have been in trying to preserve the accuracy of what they are passing on. And of course, we know that there's been many theories put forward as to how they could pass on copies of the scriptures so accurately, but the long and the short of it is this: there is no evidence out there, there is nothing out there that adequately explains the accuracy of the Bible and how it has been transmitted over 1,000 years down to us today. The only real explanation for it is that a supernatural hand was involved, that this book was supernaturally preserved. This morning we noticed in looking at Bible prophecy that the Bible has a supernatural origin. You can't tell the future. But in looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find that the Bible has a supernatural preservation. But the story doesn't stop there, because in 1979 there was an archaeologist by the name of Abi Barkay who in Jerusalem decided to excavate this rocky knoll here near St. Andrew's Church. And in doing so, he uncovered an ancient tomb that had long since been looted for all of its possessions. But in a small chamber like this, he found an area that had collapsed and covered over a whole treasure trove of over 1,000 pieces from antiquity of incredible value. And as they were going through this, they discovered 2 small silver scrolls. And it took them many months to figure out how to unroll these scrolls so that they could read them. But when they did, they found once again they had a portion of the Bible. This time, though, rather than being from the time of Christ and a little bit before the time of Christ, 100 years or so before the time of Christ, these ones dated all the way back to when the descendants of Solomon and David were on the throne, and Solomon's temple was still standing. This took them back another 500 years older, to a much older period of time. And of course, once again, they wanted to know how much has changed in how the Bible has been handed down. And once again, they found it word for word, the Bible that we have today. How does that happen? Over a 1,500-year period, that it comes down unchanged. The only adequate explanation is that a supernatural power has been involved. And so if we put it on our chart right up here, we find that the Dead Sea Scrolls is our oldest ones here, the Masoretic text. Our Dead Sea Scrolls take us back to about this time period here. And then, of course, our Silver Scrolls go all the way back there. Now, friends, I wish that I had the time here this afternoon to take you through some of the amazing codes and symbols that you find in the Bible and in other ancient manuscripts that show the supernatural origins of this book. But unfortunately, this is a short seminar, and so if you're going to study that more deeply, then I would suggest that you go and see my good friend Wayne Boehm, and he will be able to sort you out with a whole series of Bible studies, a number of series of Bible studies that we've put together to cover these subjects in detail. A couple of other, the next thing that I want to share with you is this one right here. And that is the supernatural effect of the Bible. The Bible makes this claim about itself. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. And so in researching this one, I wanted to find out and I wanted to discover for myself, what really has been the impact of the Scriptures on our globe, on our world. And so I looked at the predominant religious heritage of various countries and then looked for, well, how does that actually impact the psyche of the country? How does it impact the culture of the country? How does the impact of the presence of the Scriptures as a foundation for that country carry on down through to how that country then relates to others and so forth? And to give just to sort of get a rough handle on it, one of the things that I looked at was, how does a country relate to those who are the weaker amongst them? Those that they can dominate over. And so, being keenly interested in history, as an example, I went back to the Second World War. You see, you go back to the time of the Second World War, and the world was a much more religious place than what it is now. And countries were much more religious in their foundation and in the effect that would then have on the country as a whole. Now, of course, this is just a general observation, but I wanted to know, okay, how does that then carry over? Does the Bible have an effect on the way that a country would relate to, say, for instance, prisoners of war? So did countries that had a foundation on the Bible and a belief in the Bible, did that have a better effect on how they treated those who were at their mercy? And so I did some quick research and came up with this. I think you'll find it most interesting because you'll find this illustrated in a number of different ways. And so this is the prisoner of war mortality rate. If you were a prisoner of war held in Britain, you had a higher chance of survival than if you were a British citizen, at 0.03% mortality rate. The USA, of course, you had to make that trip across the Atlantic and face being torpedoed on the way, so that was a little bit higher. But then it goes up quite dramatically from there, doesn't it? Now, what is interesting is that you can look at this from a number of different perspectives. You can look at it in relationship to women, for example. You can look at the same concept and just as an example of that. And one of the things that jumped out to me in looking at this is that religion without morality is worse than no religion at all. Did you notice that? Religion that does not have moral absolutes is worse than no religion at all. And, you can look at, for instance, right now at a country like Thailand, where there are 1 million sex slaves, producing $6.5 billion to the Thai economy each year. And 1 in 10 of every tourist dollars that is spent there is spent on sex slaves. By the way, that was 1 million child sex slaves, I should say. This is not a black and white rule by any stretch of the imagination, but it is an interesting observation. You can also look at the relationship that various countries have to the rule of law and your general safety when you step out on the street to drive a motor vehicle. And what you find is that where the Bible is the foundation of that country, it has an effect and has had, I should say, an effect on the psyche of that country. The way that country thinks and the way that country relates to itself and to others. Of course, sadly, the Bible is very rapidly disappearing from our world today, and the French Revolution is a great example of what happens when the Bible disappears. But I want to move on from there. Of course, we talked earlier about some of the codes and symbols that you'll find in the Bible. I thought I'd give you a couple of quick examples of some of the things that you can find if you are going to study into the codes and symbols. This is, of course, a very condensed version of a much longer presentation. When I was asked to come up here, I'm like, yeah, sure, I can speak on those subjects, no problem at all. And I got all ready for it, and then a little while ago, I suddenly realized that you've only got 20 minutes. I'm like, oh, okay. So what do you cut out and what do you leave? And I'll show you some fun things here. This one's interesting. These are the patriarchs who lived before the flood. The descendants of Adam all the way through to Noah. And if you look, for instance, at the names of these individuals and the meanings of the names, here you have the meanings of the names. So Adam means man. Seth means appointed, replacement. Enoch means mortal, sorrow, the blessed God. Descend, shall come down. Commencement, teacher, his death shall bring. Lament, despairing, comfort, and rest down here at the end. And so then, if you look at this, you say, okay, there's some really nice names, and maybe there's a name there that you could pick up for a child if you have some children on the way. Mahalal sounds like a good one right there. The blessed God, that's an awesome name. Okay, but notice what happens when you line these all up. Look at this. Man, having been appointed mortal, bringing sorrow, the blessed God shall come down, teaching, his death shall bring to the despairing comfort and rest. That's the gospel message right there, encoded within the names of the ancient patriarchs. Isn't that beautiful? And you can look at so many of these as you go through the Bible. But as we finish off, I just wanted to show you something else very quickly that I found fascinating. And I want to take you back to a code that was put together that explains the gospel message that was actually created before this book right here, that actually predates this book. In a civilization, the oldest continuous civilization on this planet, and of course I refer to China, and you'll find this amongst the traditional Chinese characters, which have gone through 4 different generations, but the radicals remain the same. And so, for instance, if you take something like this and you say, okay, here's a word right here, and to us that's meaningless, but for those of you who are Chinese, you'll be able to read that word straight away and know what it means. Just don't say anything yet. But this is a character made up of various radicals. And the question that goes through your mind, why do you put certain radicals together to create a word? What was in the mind of the person who is inventing these hieroglyphs? And so here you have the king who is... You've got ears on top, so that means it's the king who is the lamb. So you have a king who is also a lamb. That's an interesting concept. And beneath that, you have the symbol of a hand. And on the other side of that, you have the symbol of a knife. So why would you put a king who is a lamb, a hand, and a knife all together to create the word for righteousness? You see, when the king is over me, it makes me righteous. When my hand takes a knife to the king who is the lamb, it makes me righteous. It's beautiful, isn't it? Here's another doozy right here. You have a small canoe. Here's 2 guys in their little canoe, and they've got their paddle out the side. They're paddling along. And then you add these radicals together. Here you've got this one right here is a mouth. It's a person. There's a number 8. 8 mouths to feed in the boat makes a enormous ship. I wonder where that story came from. And you can look at another one right here. You have breath and you have dust being combined together. Makes a mouth. That's a person. But it's not just an ordinary kind of person. It is a living person. So here's his head and here's his arms and he's standing on the land. So dust plus breath makes, God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. And so we have the gospel message right here. That, of course, brings us to the word create. Here's another beauty. Here you have the divine being from above who comes down in the form of comes down as rain, I should say, in the form of 3 persons, and he works. And when he works, the result of that work is 2 people. Here you see the 2 little stick people standing right here, and that word is the word spirit. And we could go on and on with so many more. We'll do a couple more. We can see we've got some time here. Here you've got 2 trees. And you've got God. So you've got God here, and above God you've got these 2 trees. So this is their roots coming down here, and the trees growing up. This is the land right here. And the word is forbidden. God reveals what is forbidden with how many trees? 2 trees. Where do you find that? You find that story in the book of Genesis. And we can look at another one. I like this one because you have another symbol from a divine being that comes down from above, God, places his blanket over those who understand the writing about the number 7, and those who understand the writing about the number 7, they are a devout person. And of course, if we turn in our Bibles, we find that our Bibles describe our world being made in 7 days. Isn't that so? We have a 7-day week, and that 7-day week is universal. And we can look around the world, and we know exactly where we know exactly where the year comes from. It comes from the Earth rotating around the sun. We know where the day comes from, the Earth rotating on its axis. We know where the month comes from. The month comes from the cycle of the moon, and we know where the 7-day week comes from that is universal from one side of our globe to the other. It comes from the Bible. Those who understand the writing about the number 7. All right, so here we have another symbol for God, and a symbol for one, and a symbol for a person. Here's his mouth once again. So God gives one man a garden, but not just an ordinary kind of garden. This garden has 4 rivers in it. Well, where do you read about a garden with 4 rivers in it? Once again, in the book of Genesis. And you'll find this one often in restaurants and so forth, because it is the word for blessing. You give a man a garden with 4 rivers in it, and he is a blessed man. Oh, very quickly, a tree and a mouth. The word is refrain. Refrain your mouth from the fruit of one tree. Friends, we could look at so many things here, but we are out of time, and so I need to finish up. But friends, what I want to point out to you is this. The gospel story has been given to humanity. It has been given specifically to us through this book right here. This is a book that has a supernatural origin. It has a supernatural preservation. It has a supernatural effect even on people who do not believe in it when they live in a country where it has formed the foundation of that country. And God's gospel message has been given to us right here. This is no ordinary book. If you have never studied this book before, if you have never looked into it right here, let me commend it to you. You owe it to yourself to understand what this book says.
Thank you very much, Lyle. And unfortunately, this was his second presentation, the last presentation he's making. We did have a number of questions that came through. I just would encourage you, if you did have some questions, Lyle will be waiting during the interval, and you can come up and share that with him. We want to give you a small gift and wish you well in your ministry in Maitland, as well as around the world in your speaking ministry. God bless you. Would you just thank him once again? Thanks, buddy. Bless you. Well, here we are. Once again, we have an interval in front of us. We're just going to take a short afternoon break, but let me alert you to just a couple of things coming up. At 6:30 tonight in the foyer, there will be several booths set up with all kinds of resources available for purchase. We're talking books and DVDs, even music CDs. A few of our musical artists featured today will have CDs available for purchase. So be here between 6:30 and 7 to check out the myriad of resources on offer. Then at 7 p.m. in this place, Toowoomba's historic Empire Theater, we'll be screening the documentary film premiere, Kingdom Come. And let me tell you, you are in for a treat. This doco has been filmed on location in Iran, in Greece, Berlin, Oxford, and Cambridge universities. It takes an in-depth look into what many have described as the atomic bomb of Bible prophecy. You'll have to come tonight to find out what that is. But we've thrown open the doors to anyone who would like to attend, free entry. And it's interesting to note, just to get into this building costs significantly, but we're inviting people to not only sit in the lush theater here, but to watch this amazing documentary. So be sure and come early, because we are hoping and believing that it will fill up very quickly. And if you know anyone that maybe hasn't been here today, but would be open to coming and viewing this with us, invite them, have them come and join us. Just once again, just want to reiterate, come early so that you can get a good seat. Okay, so take a few minutes, stretch, use the restrooms, get a drink, and maybe come back. In 20 minutes, there will be, if you're not here, if I can use my biblical illusion, there might be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I'm only kidding, but you will be better off if you have found your seat before we begin the next session. Thank you. please put your hands together once again for Gabriel on the saxophone and Vesna on the piano. These guys are awesome. They are from Brisbane. I have never heard them before, but I hope to hear them again. Get more information about them. Our next artist will share from a new form, genre, I guess, although some of you might say, oh, that's not new, but it's becoming very popular. Maybe, again, he will be sharing the spoken word. Please welcome Jared Chapman.
Eyes that were formed from the dust would lose sight of love and turn to lust. Boys would grow into men who women could no longer trust due to desires and passions embedded deep beneath the crust. Who knew these eyes would become so polluted from continually seeing women abused, treated as objects instead of human beings? Now love is no longer a choice, but only a feeling. Feelings that often struggle dealing with patience and respect because selfless love is no longer appealing. Who knew that a quick glance at a magazine would over time shape your destiny, where pornography seen throughout your youth would become ingrained in your memory? Memories that became easier to remember than to forget, now they hover over you mentally, destroying your ability to love and be loved. Now you are your own worst enemy. Even if love was right in front of you, you couldn't see it because you're trapped in a psychological coma, unaware of the recipe. And when the time finally arrives and you meet that girl of your dreams, but still you're feeling empty because now it seems she's not as pretty as the girl you once knew in those magazines, on your computer screens. Looking back throughout your childhood, it's a mystery how you can't forget the past but can delete your website history. For what is your definition of love even founded on? What is your basis? Maybe the problem is you, being trapped inside an imaginary oasis where love is just about feelings that take you to emotional places, because the love the world has shown you is shallow and baseless. Today the music is overly sexualized wherever you listen. All you can hear is lust painting lies that taint your vision, but you don't even notice. Because the beat sounds dope and the message is hidden behind trying to harmonize love with objectifying women. Now, you're unconscious to the fact you're trapped inside a psychological prison, bound by selfishness and greed, where love is missing. Because sadly, this society tells girls your value is based on how much we can see of your flesh. The more you can get undressed and the more likes and followers on social media you can get. Today, love isn't based on the person, but on the shape of you, the silhouette. And today, boys keep scrolling through their feeds and quickly they're onto the next girl. The pursuit of love becomes a roller coaster, a never-ending quest that emphasizes impulses over wisdom. There's no rest. On the other hand, it's true love that chooses to wait, where lust dives in too fast for relationships to go beyond anything physical, exponentially decreasing the length they can last. This society has made true love a thing of the past. And the victims of a society driven by lust are left all alone. Husbands leave their wives to wander and to roam, while their children grow up homeless, while still living inside a home. It's these kids who, due to neglect, have become more prone to experiencing the same hurt on their paths the parents have known. How are they meant to know love if it's lust they're continually shown? So allow me to explain the difference between love and lust. Let me attempt to make a psychological shift where one is the thief and the other is the gift. Where one heals your wounds, where the other makes an incision. You see, both have their impact. Both will shape your vision. You see, looking back, who you are today revolves around your decisions. You see, you make your choices, and your choices make you. So what kind of images of love are you choosing to view? Maybe you're blind by the fact you can't see love's portrait. If only you knew. So for those unaware of what love is, let me tell you the real definition. Love is a journey, a lifelong expedition where loyalty, faith, trust, and forgiveness are freely given without no hope of return, no thought of recognition. You see, love is unconditional. It willingly flows without conditions. For love is patient, persevering, hoping against hope. Love is kind. Love is giving, not self-seeking. It's time to remove the poison that inhabits your mind. For lust is easy to discover, where true love is hard to find. See, love isn't about those feelings and emotions you get that fade over time. For love still loves, despite flaws and weaknesses. Love isn't blind. For love says what love does. Words mixed with actions, seamlessly intertwined. For love is God, and God is love. With his own hands, in his very image, you were made. To a world that no longer knew their creator, he came to save the broken, the lost, the unlovable, the prodigal son who had strayed. For God so loved the world that he gave everything to give you a hope, an anchor that cannot be moved despite the waves, and when the winds rage and the storms hail and ships sink deep into the depths, never to sail. Love stands firm because love never fails. Thank you.
Wasn't that cool? Jared will be back a little later. We're looking forward to that. Now, I keep forgetting to welcome our viewers, not in this building, but in places as far away as Africa, North America, and Asia, and I want to just welcome you. In fact, why don't you put your hands together and thank these many more people that are in this building for being with us. Our technical team, yes, it's so good to have you with us. Our technical team keeps whispering in our ears mind-boggling numbers of the people viewing what's happening here at PropheticA, so we are very grateful to have you with us. Our next speaker is an advanced accredited practicing dietitian, a credential awarded to less than 2% of dietitians in Australia today, and one of Australia's leading nutritionists and health communicators. She is frequently sought out for comment by the media and has conducted hundreds of print, radio, and TV interviews throughout her career. An award-winning author, her most recent work, Food as Medicine, Eating for Your Best Health, received the Gorman and World Cookbook Award for Best Health and Nutrition Book in both the Australian and world categories. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Sue Radd. Thank you.
When we get the first picture up. Thank you. Each week at my clinic in Sydney, we have patients that attend that ask questions like, I've just been diagnosed with a high cholesterol and the doctors threatened to put me on a statin. Is there anything I can do to avoid that? Or, I've just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and the doctor said I'm going to have to take metformin. Can I change the way I eat or live to avoid that? And even more recently, a lady in her early 40s arrived in my clinic. She could barely walk. And she said, I am riddled with arthritis. I'm on maximum painkillers and I'm also on steroids. Is there anything I can do to feel better? And the answer is absolutely yes. You can use food as your medicine. In fact, we are only now in science rediscovering what ancient people always knew. Food is our medicine, the original medicine, not only to reduce risk factors such as high blood pressure and high blood sugar, but actually to reduce the risk of hard outcomes such as heart attack, stroke, and cancer. We now know that about 80% of all these chronic conditions are totally preventable. But even if you have a condition, so you might be sitting there thinking, but I've already got diabetes, or I already have an elevated cholesterol. Did you know that if you use the right food, you can make your medication work harder? In other words, you might be able to get away with a lower dose because your medication will be more effective if you also use food as your medicine. So these days, most people get their information about diet and nutrition from a whole range of sources. Unfortunately, they are most unreliable. Whether it's the blogosphere, whether it's books, magazines, latest fad diet, or even traditional media, the problem with these sources of information about your diet is that they can usually only be considered with a grain of salt. They're not evidence-based, and they're always changing. So people often say, well, you guys are forever changing your mind. No, actually the basic advice about what constitutes a healthy diet hasn't changed all that much over the last 20 or 30 years. But what changes is how it's reported in the media, and also the many so-called experts that set themselves up to give dietary advice without having any qualifications. The second source of information that is trustworthy and that people can trust, of course, is their doctor. But the problem there is that doctors today are being so worked hard, they have to cram in more patients in less time than ever before, that they don't know where to start first. And the last thing they have time for is to give you dietary advice. And in a recent study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by researchers from Harvard University, they found that only about 12% of visits to a doctor resulted in any dietary counselling. And even for patients who already had the risk factors, such as the diabetes or the high blood pressure, only 1 in 5 got any dietary advice. Another reason why this might not be occurring in your doctor's office, as illustrated here in an article in USA Today, is that doctors are not specifically trained to give you nutritional and dietary advice, and they don't feel very comfortable in doing it unless they have had further training. Fortunately, all of that is likely to change. Most recently, in the United States of America, there are now more than 10 medical schools that offer food as medicine or culinary medicine as elective subjects. Unfortunately, no medical school in Australia is yet doing that. So in future, don't be surprised if when you go to your doctor's surgery, you get a prescription for a handful of nuts every day, or a 15-minute walk in the morning and a 15-minute walk in the evening, because lifestyle medicine is going to become a much, much bigger thing in the future. And that's not to say that real medication, or drugs as we call them in science, doesn't have a role to play. It's just that why not avail yourself of all the simple, natural, low-tech, inexpensive, easy things that you can do first before needing to take the hardcore stuff, and leave that for when you really, really need it. So you could go and see an accredited practicing dietitian. Now, I don't know if you know this, but dietitians in Australia need to do 5 years at university, so that's as long as a dentist, before they come out with their masters in nutrition and dietetics. But the problem there again is that for most people, there is a cost barrier, because the government in Australia, certainly through its Medicare program, will only subsidise up to 5 visits per calendar year to a dietitian. And that is if you've already got a chronic disease. So to qualify, you need to have a chronic disease, and also those visits are meant to be shared with other allied health professionals, such as perhaps a physio or a podiatrist. So that clearly is a big barrier for many people to getting some professional advice. So what's the result? If people aren't using lifestyle medicine to try and prevent diseases we're finding are now coming on a lot earlier. We are now seeing children with type 2 diabetes. When I first started studying at university more than 30 years ago, type 2 diabetes was not called type 2 diabetes. Do you know what it was called? It was called adult onset diabetes. So all these chronic conditions that are mostly preventable are presenting earlier, and people are being medicated very early for the rest of their life. In fact, this recent study, cross-sectional study published in the Medical Journal of Australia, found that 87% of Australians now take at least one medication. And 43.3%, that's almost getting close to half, are taking 5 pills every single day. Now, apart from the cost, to your back pocket, people are not that keen on taking medication. At least that's what they tell me, because they're forever coming and saying, is there something else I can do? They're concerned about the side effects, and that's a good thing to be concerned about. But in addition to that, there is some evidence that perhaps not all of the medication is as effective as you might think. For example, a very recent review in Europe of all the top drugs that have just been released onto the market for cancer found that about half of them, or for at least about half of them, there is no evidence that they increase survival or improve quality of life for cancer patients. And for other conditions such as dementia, and this is the area that I'm working on at the University of Sydney, we're looking at lifestyle modalities such as diet, physical activity, and so on, that may have a great influence on your thinking and reasoning ability to prevent dementia. Because for dementia, there is no drug your doctor can give you. There's nothing to prevent it, there's nothing to reverse it, there's nothing to slow its progression. So you can see there is a huge role for lifestyle medicine modalities such as diet to play, and we believe that the earlier you start, the more benefit you're going to reap. So really, as someone once said, we should be getting most of our medicine from the farm and not the pharmacy. And when it comes to the type of medicine that is best, most research now suggests that it is food that is plant-based. Food that comes from the garden, not from the butcher or from the dairy. And not just plant-based, but unrefined plant foods. So something more like this, which is a beautiful ratatouille I had when I was at a conference in Spain, and not like this, which is something a colleague of mine ordered when we were in South Africa, yet for another conference. If you're wanting to find a very simple guide to help you in planning your meals, this plate might be of help. So notice, the first thing you'll probably notice is that it's no longer meat and 3 veg. Can you see that? No meat and 3 veg. Actually, about half of your meal, half of every main meal should constitute vegetables or salads, whether they're cooked or raw or a combination, that's fine. Only about a quarter should be in terms of whole grains, and we'll look at some of those examples in a minute. And another quarter is best to come from plant proteins, not animal proteins. So does a plant-based diet actually work? Well, I suggested it does. Let me quickly tell you 3 stories. So going back to those examples I mentioned earlier. So when Ruth came to my clinic, and that's the lady in the middle, and by the way, Ruth is a health professional herself, but not a dietitian. She's done a lot of reading. She said, I just do not want to take a statin. I know the risks associated with dementia, of taking a statin. I know the risks with type 2. I do not want to take it. Is there anything I can do? I will do anything. And I said, well, if you're prepared to go that far, yes, there is. And let's really go that far. Let's hit this really hard. So I put her on what we call a portfolio diet. And this is not one of those magazine diets. This terminology comes from the University of Toronto in Canada, where they've been studying this plant-based portfolio of foods that collectively can lower your cholesterol as much as a starting dose of a statin. So when Ruth started on the portfolio diet, her cholesterol was 6.1. Within 3 months, and of course we tend to see our patients quite regularly because it's not that easy to change your lifestyle. You need to get a lot of support, you need to learn all the stuff, and remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, so that's quite normal. 3 months later, her cholesterol had dropped to 4.1. 33% reduction, that's something you can achieve with a drug. And at that university, they have done studies comparing this portfolio of plant foods directly against a medication, and they are just as effective. All depends on your compliance. Another lady that came to see me who had the type 2 diabetes, her what's called HbA1c, which is basically an average measure of your blood sugar control over 3 months, her HbA1c was 6.5%, so she was diabetic. After putting her on a total plant-based diet, so we brought out the big guns, so that means no dairy, no meat, but really focusing hard on those plant foods that are unrefined, her HbA1c just within 3 months dropped to 5.8%. Now that might not sound like a big drop to you, but that's a 0.7% reduction. And for certain medications, they've shown that they can lower your HbA1c by 0.4%. And everyone gets excited at that. So diet absolutely works. And the other lady I mentioned, the younger lady, 42-year-old, a nurse on her feet, has a family to feed as well, but barely walked into my office. She was in that much pain. I said to her, look, I don't know how this is going to go down with your whole family, but we need to, again, hit this really hard. Are you prepared to just try for a 3 to 6 month period to see if this can help you? And she said, I will do anything. She was virtually in tears. So we put her on a total plant-based diet. Next week, when she came to see me, and honestly, I've seen great things happen, but next week, so 1 week later, she walked in, she was grinning from ear to ear. And she said, Sue, I just have to tell you, almost all my pain is gone, except a little bit still in my ankles. And I said, really? Even I was a bit surprised. She said, yes, really. And she's been in pain for a long time. I've continued to see her. She is now off all of her painkillers, and her rheumatologist has been able to reduce the dose of the steroids she was on. So she's now at the very, very lowest level and hoping to get off that entirely. So does it work? Absolutely. The science shows that it does. We don't have time to review those studies now, but I've just shared with you 3 actual examples showing that it can work if you choose to adopt it. Now, the only actual study I'm going to show you is this one, because this takes us to an area of very recent research that is highly relevant for all chronic diseases, and that's to do with your microbiome. So the bugs that live inside your gut, we call them microbes or microbiota. They produce all kinds of substances, and it's those substances that they produce that signal with your immune system, or that talk to your brain within hours of eating the food. And they're the ones responsible for keeping you well or making you sick. So in this very interesting study, and they were looking at cancer markers, they decided to take African American men and swap their diets with African men living in rural villages in Africa. You can imagine how different the diets would have been, and I've just got a couple of pictures there to show you. So the traditional American diet, very low in fibre, very high in the wrong type of fat, and the African diet, very high in plant foods, very, very high in fibre. In just 14 days, everything changed for the better in the most remarkable way. And we know from other studies, in 14 days, you will start to lower your cholesterol, you will start to lower your blood pressure. But in 14 days, they were able to measure changes in their gut, showing that the amount of inflammation was being reduced. Inflammation is a driver of all chronic disease, including cancer. Anything that can block or reduce inflammation is considered to be very desirable. In addition, they were able to show that when the American African men started eating this high-fibre, plant-based, rural African diet, they were making more butyrate in their gut. Now, what on earth is butyrate? Butyrate is what we call a short-chain fatty acid. This is something that the good bugs make when they ferment the fibre that you eat. So we can't digest the fibre, our enzymes can't do it. That's meant to be the food for the good guys to look after you. When they ferment it, they make butyrate. And butyrate is being studied now for 20 plus years, is an incredibly important molecule that protects you against cancer, that gets absorbed into your body and does many other wonderful things in your liver. The other thing that happened, the men who switched to the, to the American diet, the rural Africans switched to the Western style food, increased their production by 400% of what we call secondary bile acids. And the other way around, it was a 70% reduction. Now again, why are you telling me this? What are secondary bile acids? If we could block inside your gut the production of secondary bile acids, you probably would never get colon cancer. So secondary bile acids are converted from the first or the primary bile acids that your liver makes and get squirted from your gallbladder into your gut to help digest fats when you eat. But the bad bugs that can live in our gut convert these to secondary, and these are cancer-causing substances. So in just 14 days, these men, by switching their diets, changing the whole microbiome, and we can already measure inside what is going on. The problem is it's all silent, right? If you could feel it, you'd be watching every mouthful. So my great belief is that every meal is an opportunity to either heal yourself or harm yourself, okay? While you can't feel it, things are happening. Within hours of eating, things happen in your gut, and there is cross-signaling, not just to the brain, but to other organs in the body and to your immune system. So every meal, as I see it, is an opportunity. The question is, what are you doing with it? Let's quickly look at some of the foods that you could start eating more or you could swap to. So for example, instead of a slab of steak, you could switch to eating more beans or exclusively go beans. Beans in most traditional societies were the original meat from the soil. And many studies show that when you feed men with beans instead of meat, they're really happy because beans fill you up. Beans are very, very filling, and they also have an extremely low glycemic index, which means they're the perfect food for anyone with insulin resistance or diabetes. When it comes to carbohydrate foods, instead of eating that white rice or that fluffy white bread that you might have, switch to the whole grain forms like nature intended. Whole grain carbohydrates do all the right things in the body. They feed your hungry microbiome, and they can have very low glycemic indexes like barley. And glycemic index is just a measure of how quickly a food will raise your blood sugar and then your insulin level. And with your bread, of course, we're going to go sourdough and heavy and grainy and dense and seeded, but instead of the margarines and butters, people always ask, which is better? Neither. Use traditionally produced, or at least produced in the way that oil used to be produced, extra virgin plant oils, such as extra virgin olive oil. Briefly this morning it was mentioned that compounds called polyphenols are very important for slowing down premature aging. They're important for everything. Extra virgin olive oil is loaded in polyphenols, but you won't get that in Nuttalex, you won't get that in butter. And why not make vegetables the centre stage? Why relegate them to a side dish? In traditional societies, vegetables were the dish. So this is just an example of a village stew from Greece, and it's whatever's in season. Here's another example of a main dish, not a side dish, with green beans because they're in season. And in Spain, they have this word sofrito, and sofrito just means this combination of extra virgin olive oil, onions, and tomato. And there's something really important in that combination, which is used in many, many recipes in the Mediterranean because it's very high in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory phytonutrients. And when it comes to vegetables as sides, don't forget the dark leafy greens. These are crucial for your brain, for your eyes and for your blood vessels, particularly because they're very rich in something called lutein. And the only two places in your body that lutein gets concentrated in are the back of your eyes, the macula, and in your brain. Lutein is a potent antioxidant, and you only get it from these very dark, leafy green vegetables. And what about fruit? What about fruit? In Australia, it's just fruit. Everyone wants a biscuit or a pudding or a dessert. But in traditional societies, fruit was the snack and fruit was the dessert. I think we need to rediscover that, because the recent research suggests that fruit is strongly protective against stroke. And if you're really feeling peckish for something else between meals, don't forget those nuts and seeds. We've known now for more than 20 years that people who consume nuts or seeds 5 times a week or more, compared to once a week or less, have a 50% lower risk of heart attack. Yet when I first started practicing, the Heart Foundation used to say, avoid nuts. Remember those days? They're high in fat. We've now come to learn that oils ain't oils. There are different types of fats. What you want is fats in their natural food matrix that come with all those phytonutrients, the antioxidants, and that you mostly get in the actual skin of the nuts. And let's not forget water, the original drink. If you only switched all those sugary drinks just to plain water, already you'd be making great gains in terms of your healthcare. 5 glasses a day, minimum. Yes, if you can do 6 to 8, but at 5 glasses a day, we already have evidence that that probably will reduce your risk of heart attack, stroke, and possibly bladder cancer. So, why wait? As my 6-year-old nephew recently said when he told his auntie he wanted a Nike t-shirt, he said, "Auntie, just do it." And take the whole family on the journey with you. Delegate, share the responsibility for procuring the food, preparing the food, and the wash-up arrangements. And don't forget to pass on the legacy. Teach food literacy. It's not being taught at school anymore, certainly not the way it was when I was at school. If you don't teach them, who will? And remember to take time to enjoy those meals with somebody you love, your family or friends. The research clearly shows the more meals that you cook at home and eat with a family, the healthier is your diet. So just in wrapping up, it's never too late to start. Whatever your age, whatever your goal in life, you will still get benefits. But the earlier you start, the better. For example, for dementia, we now believe to treat dementia, you need to start when you're 30. All these diseases take decades to develop. Small changes can make a big difference. Simply switching that white rice to whole grains like bulgur wheat or freekeh can make a significant difference to your blood glucose and insulin levels after meals. I clearly believe that food as medicine will be part of the future, and a very big part, because we have an aging population. We have increasing risks of chronic diseases. Yes, we're getting better at managing some, treating some. So survival rates, for example, for breast cancer have increased, but the incidence for breast cancer continues to go up. So the only solution to that is food and our lifestyle as our medicine. The good thing is you can save money, and you can stay away from hospitals and procedures for longer, and you'll be doing your part to help with animal welfare and planetary health. And finally, if you don't know where to start, need some inspiration, this book that I've just recently published has 150 plant-based recipes that even a dedicated carnivore will enjoy. Thank you very much.
Well, Sue, the questions are pouring in. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. But the good news is they'll be able to ask you these questions afterwards. You'll be in the speaker's booth. So, but let me put a couple to you. First of all, what do you think about vitamin supplements, or can you get everything you need from a good diet even today with the soil depletion that we hear about?
That's a big question. I'm going to try and summarize it quickly. Most things you can get from a whole foods, plant-based diet. There are some areas, such as, for example, vitamin B12, that you do need to supplement with. The concern at the moment in science with just taking any vitamin or mineral supplement is that we're getting studies now that are showing us that some of these do more harm than good. For example, years ago, if you had osteoporosis or you were a postmenopausal woman, the first thing the doctor would do is put you on a calcium supplement until the New Zealanders discovered that the women taking high-dose calcium supplements were dying off early from heart attack and stroke. So there is a strong move now to take pills, vitamins, minerals, only when really needed under the guidance of a healthcare professional such as your doctor or dietitian, not to self-medicate, because the best and the safest way is to get it through the whole food. There's something protective about getting it in that package. The nutrients are absorbed quite differently. The pharmacokinetics are quite different. That's the safest way, and that's what I would recommend.
Great answer, thank you. Is salt an essential mineral for the body, as we know that salt produces stomach acid, and a lack of salt can prevent absorption?
A small amount of salt is needed. The problem in Australia, in most Western countries, is people consume up to 5 times more than they require. And if you have the gene that makes you salt sensitive and you consume salt regularly in your diet, and mostly it's not what you're adding, it's actually through common foods like bread or cheese, which actually have a lot of salt in them per serve. If you consume salt regularly in those forms, you will, or at least there's a 9 out of 10 chance, and this comes from the Framingham study in the US, which is the longest running study in the world ever, more than 50 years, they've been tracking these people, you will develop high blood pressure. So you can't tell by looking at someone, your doctor can't tell by measuring your blood pressure. There are gene tests now that we can have you do, and if you are salt sensitive, one of the things is to reduce your sodium intake. So you still have some, but very low levels to slow the rise in the blood pressure as we get older.
Thank you. This person writes, I have an extremely low ferritin count in my blood. How can I increase the levels of ferritin in my blood without taking supplements?
The first question is, why is your ferritin low? And this is something your doctor should and will explore with you. For women, there are some really good reasons why ferritin can drop low, especially if they're premenopausal. And in some of those cases, the only way you can bring it up is with a high-dose supplement, at least to get you up, and then you might need a low-dose one, or food could hold you there. Certainly for the rest of us who don't have any major cause, except perhaps poor dietary intake, high iron plant food sources would include things like legumes, whole grains, certain dried fruits and even certain types of dark green leafy vegetables, but not spinach, because the iron is actually absorbed in spinach with oxalate, which prevents its absorption into your body.
Okay. Boy. How about this one? I understand your award-winning book has gone international. Is this correct? Tell us more.
Yes, it is correct. Thank goodness for that. Actually, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, I didn't have the personal pleasure to be there because when you're doing research at uni, it's very hard to get away. But the book has just been translated and presented at the Frankfurt Book Fair. So it's been translated into the German language. Okay. And they're the first country in the world to have it in German. And more news to come. Probably in a couple of years it'll be out in Swedish and Norwegian languages, and we hope in many other countries too.
One more question, and I really like this one. This question says, is it possible to be as big as Rome Yulia? Now, did you see Rome? His arm is 3 times the size of mine. Without eating meat? If so, how do I get required protein? We only got about a minute left.
Oh my goodness, this is fun. I have to be careful what I say. But what do elephants eat?
Yeah, good point. Good point.
You
there was
could
an
be
elephant
pretty
on the
big,
stage earlier.
Strong, powerful.
Yeah, they eat
through plants.
Vegetables. Yeah.
They eat plants. It's a matter of how much you eat and how you do it. So we work with elite athletes. There are ways to do it even if you choose to go plant-based.
Amazing. Would you put your hands together and thank Sue Radd for her time with us? Let me offer you a special gift. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you so much.
And I want to just remind you once again, you can buy her book at 6:30 when we open up those booths. So come here, back here for that. And you can ask her whatever question that you would like at the next break that we have.
Thank you very much.
I want to just remind you, I did make this announcement in the beginning of the day, that if you have an interest in future events related to the subjects that we have been talking about, certainly in the area of health, in the area of prophecy, and even later we'll be addressing family issues, I want to encourage you to fill out that white future events card. And that has a list of a bunch of different areas that we're going to be planning events going forward towards the end of this year and certainly into next year. So fill that out and then give it to somebody in a purple shirt, polo shirt, and it'll say PropheticA on it. Not everybody there might be some who have a purple shirt that doesn't qualify. So it's got to say PropheticA on their shirt. But hand the card to them, and then we'll keep you in the loop of upcoming events. All right. Our next speaker was at one time an extreme sports enthusiast and a punk rocker. I don't know what a punk rocker is. I haven't been able to ask him. At 23 years of age, he had a dramatic paradigm shift after reading a Christian commentary tracing the hand of God through history from creation to the end of the world. The book, written over 100 years ago, yet still a bestseller today, is called The Great Controversy. His newfound Christian faith became the catalyst for a changed life and unearthed an extraordinary ability to communicate in compelling ways some of the most mysterious and challenging teachings of the Bible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Asscherick.
All right, thank you. All right, good afternoon, PropheticA. It's a little quiet in here. That makes me nervous. People ask me if I ever get nervous, and the answer is no, unless you get really quiet. That's what makes me nervous. He says he's never seen what a punk rocker looks like or what one is. Well, you're looking at one right now. Right? I always get a little nervous when they say he used to be a punk rocker because I still feel like in many ways I am. We'll tell you that story tomorrow. Well, I've been asked to speak on the Christmas prophecies. And I don't know what comes to your mind when you hear the word Christmas, but I would imagine it's probably sled rides in the snow, and chestnuts roasting on an open fire, snowmen with coal eyes and carrots for nose. Am I anywhere near? Well, my family and I have lived here down under Mite since 2014, and we're just trying to get our minds around this idea that summer and Christmas are the same thing. And so I'm going to talk to you today about the Christmas prophecies. Whatever comes to your mind in terms of weather, for many people today, Christmas has the idea of rampant consumerism and materialism run amok, right? We think about trees and we think about shopping, and in America at least we think about the phenomenon known as Black Friday. And this has caused some that are more Christian and religious in their orientation to sort of push back against the rampant consumerism and say, wait a minute. It's not all about the gifts and all of the goodies. It's about Jesus. Jesus is the reason for the season. I always liked that. It sounds really cool. I remember the first time I saw that slogan, my mom was wearing a pin that said, Jesus is the reason for the season. And today I want to talk to you about some amazing Christmas prophecies. The first thing I want to say right up front, the name of the event here is PropheticA. The root word here is this idea of prophecy. And you might be inclined incorrectly, mistakenly, to think of a prophecy as a kind of prediction. It is not. A prediction has built into it a measure of doubt or of uncertainty. When we talk about prophecy, and especially biblical prophecies, what we're saying is not a prediction, something that you might be able to say, well, the odds are pretty good there. What we're talking about is, from God's perspective, a foretelling of future events. So there's no uncertainty here. There's no perhaps. A prophecy, biblically speaking, is a foretelling of future events. And there are many of such events that we find in the Bible, so-called Bible prophecies. Israel's failures, much of the story of the Bible is the story of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, and their failures and the judgment that was upon them in captivity. Daniel chapter 2, verses 7 to 9, or Daniel chapter 2, chapters 7 to 9 is also a fascinating passage. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow in one of my presentations. Maybe others will take it up as well. And then there are dozens of what are called messianic prophecies. And that's what I want to talk to you about now, in addition to some of the great symbolic prophecies found in the book of Revelation. But I want to talk to you about number 3 up on the screen. And that's what we mean by Christmas prophecies. Messianic prophecies. Messianic comes from the root word of the Hebrew word for Messiah, which means the anointed one. Prophecies that anticipated, prophecies that looked forward to the coming of what all Jewish people hoped for, and that was a Messiah, a deliverer, someone that would be anointed. And the Bible is filled with many of these prophecies, depending on how you count and exactly where you draw the line. There could be as few as maybe 50 or 60 and more than 100, right? But there are dozens of these messianic prophecies, prophecies not that predict the coming of a Messiah, but that foretell the future in advance of a coming of Messiah. They include things like where Messiah would be born, his birthplace. And what I've got up here on the screen for you is the prophecy or the foretelling of the event in the Old Testament, and then the fulfillment of that event in the New Testament. And so, for example, in the book of Micah, it anticipates, it foretells that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And then in Matthew chapter 2, it says that he was, in fact, Jesus of Nazareth was born in Bethlehem. That his mother would be a virgin is anticipated in Isaiah 7, a miraculous birth, and then the fulfillment of that in Matthew. And so right through his tribe, that he would be from the tribe of Judah, that his family, he would be a descendant of Jesse and thus a descendant of David, the time around which he would come, the specific message that Messiah would give, his entry into Jerusalem, the fact that he would be betrayed, and not just betrayed in any general way, but that there would be a betrayal price, that he would be spat upon and mocked. And in each of these columns, you see the prophetic anticipation and then the New Testament fulfillment. Just a few more here. You have that he would be, what's the word I'm looking for here? He'd be crucified, but his bones would not be broken. He would be crucified with criminals or executed with criminals. That he would be mocked and scorned, that there would be a resurrection, and finally the timing of the event. And so these are just 15 of these messianic prophecies, these anticipations of the coming of the Jewish Messiah. Now, in 1958, a fellow by the name of Peter Stoner, who was a scientist and a professor of science at a number of universities, wrote a book, kind of an interesting book, and the book was titled Science Speaks, and it's a little bit difficult to read, but the subtitle is Scientific Proof of the Accuracy of Prophecy and the Bible. And in the book, what Dr. Stoner did was remarkable. He said, what would be the chances, randomly, of somebody just by happenstance fulfilling these various messianic prophecies? I mean, we can call them prophecies, but what if somebody just stumbled into various fulfillments of these prophecies? And Stoner says, what would be the chances of that? And so what he does is he goes through in the book and he sort of describes his methodology, and then he lays out his summary. And what he says is if you calculated just 8 of those, we mentioned 15 a moment ago, I said there was dozens and as many as 100. Dr. Stoner calculated just 8 of the Bible's messianic prophecies and concluded that the odds of one person fulfilling all of those 8 prophecies would be 10 to the 17th power. Now that's 10 with 17 zeros behind it. It is a fantastically large number. But things get really interesting when you increase the number of prophecies. He went on and said if you increase the number of prophecies to 48, the chances of one person fulfilling those randomly, by chance, happenstance, serendipitously, would be 10 with 157 zeros behind it. Now, just to give you a feel for the size of that number, the shape of that number, astrophysicists and cosmologists estimate that the total number of electrons in the universe is about 10 to the 81st power. Okay? So this number is beyond astronomical. It's effectively saying it's impossible. Absolutely, totally impossible. And the basic thesis that Stoner was making is that there had to have been some foreknowledge, some anticipation. This wasn't just randomly falling into these fulfillments, but in fact, they were anticipated, they were announced, and then they were fulfilled. And that's a key word. When we come to the first book of the New Testament, the book of Matthew, we find that Matthew's favorite word is fulfill or fulfilled. And what Matthew does is very important. It's very important from a theological perspective and also just from a larger perspective of how prophecy works and sort of just how history works. What Matthew does is he goes through the Hebrew Old Testament, beginning in Genesis and extending through the book of Malachi, and he finds many places in Israel's history, and he finds corollaries to those things in the life of Jesus. And so what he says again and again and again, oh, this event that happened in Israel's history, fulfilled in Jesus. This event fulfilled, this event fulfilled, 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 fulfilled. And these are just some of the chapters and verses in which Matthew is saying, that was fulfilled in Jesus, that was fulfilled in Jesus, that was fulfilled in Jesus. Now this is a radical interpretive technique. Because what Matthew is doing as a Jew and as a devout Jew, he's looking back over the sweep of Israel's history, and he's saying that these events in Israel's history anticipated not only Israel's actual history, but they actually anticipated Messiah's own history. That's why they're called messianic prophecies, or anticipations of a coming Messiah. Remember, Messiah means anointed or a deliverer. Here's another group of them. All the way through the book of Matthew, as I've mentioned here, this becomes his favorite word. He just can't stop looking at the Old Testament. What he's effectively done is he's gotten a pair of glasses, right? And these glasses are what theologians would call Christocentricity. That's a long, multisyllabic word that just means Christ-centered. And what Matthew's doing is, formerly, prior to the coming of Messiah and the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, as he's looking back on the events of Jesus' life, and he's just sort of associating himself with those events, as he's looking back, he's put on his glasses, and he said, wait a minute, when I put on the glasses of this microphone is driving me insane. There we go. When I put on the glasses, some people would say I'm already insane, but it's driving me more insane. Matthew says, when I put on these glasses of looking at Israel's history through the lens of Jesus, I begin to see fulfilled, 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 fulfilled. Now, let me just give you a few instances of this. Probably one of the best known is Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, when Jesus says this, do not think that I am come to abolish the law or the prophets. Now, the law and the prophets, that's basically the two divisions of the Hebrew Old Testament. The law was what's called the Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Bible or the writings of Moses. The prophets are the rest of the Old Testament. And so what Jesus says here is remarkable. This is taking place in what's called the Sermon on the Mount. He says, do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to, or not to abolish them, but to, what's the word there? But to fulfill them, right? This is an instance of the fact that this becomes Matthew's favorite word. Earlier in Matthew's own book, Matthew does something that is frankly radical and hugely helpful for us. And it's something I want to share with you here. What he does is he takes Israel's history and he compartmentalizes it. He wraps it up in a really organized and symmetrical way. He says this, there were 14 generations from Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, to David, the second king of Israel and the most loved king. Then from David to the exile in Babylon, there were 14 generations, and 14 generations from the exile in Babylon to the coming of Messiah. Now, any Jew that's reading that would immediately see the point that Matthew is making. He says there was 14, 14, 14. There were 14 from Abraham to David, from David to the captivity in Babylon, and from the captivity in Babylon to the Messiah. Any Jew would say, wait a minute, 3 14s, that's a 7, a 7, a 7, a 7, and a 7, and a 7. You have to understand that in the Jewish economy, everything revolved around, and Lyle alluded to this earlier, what are called sabbatical cycles. You had not only a weekly Sabbath where you would go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days and then rest on the Sabbath, and again, 6 days resting on the Sabbath. You also had yearly sabbatical cycles, right? So you would go through 6 years, then on the 7th year, the land would rest. But then they had cycles of those 7s. You would take not just 7 years, but 7 groups of 7. And on the year after that, so you have 7 groups of 7, which is 49, and on the 50th year, this was what was called a jubilee. And a jubilee was this really profoundly equalizing economic institution and spiritual institution in Israel's basic economy, in the way that Israel worked. And we'll talk more about the jubilee in just a second. So what we have here, if there's a 7, a 7, a 7, a 7, a 7, and a 7, and then comes Messiah, what Matthew is saying here is that in some significant sense, Messiah will be like a kind of Sabbath, that he will give rest in some sense. Jesus' ministry was a kind of Sabbath, and it anticipated the Jubilee. So unsurprisingly, we find Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew saying things like this, come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will Sabbath you. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So here we have this sabbatical anticipation There's a 7, a 7, a 7, a 7, a 7, and a 7, and here comes Messiah as the 7th 7, anticipating what comes after the 7th 7, which is Jubilee, which I want to talk a little bit about right now. When we talk about the Christmas prophecies, we think about Christmas as a time of not only, as we've mentioned, materialism and consumerism, but when we think about Christmas from a biblical perspective, from a religious perspective, from a Christian perspective, it revolves around the birth and the life of Jesus. I want to talk to you now about the institution of Jubilee. On that 50th year, after 7 cycles of 7, something very significant happened. The land was returned to its ancestral owners. In the Jewish economy, there were 12 tribes, and the land was returned to the ancestral owners. Land was leased, not purchased. Number 3, all debts were canceled, right? If there was an indebtedness, it was canceled at the Jubilee, and servants and slaves were released. All of this took place in the Jubilee. Now, this Jubilee rears its head in a really kind of funny, subtle, and nuanced way, actually, again, in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is approached by one of his best-known disciples, in this case, Peter. And it says, then Peter came to him, this is in Matthew chapter 18, and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I will forgive him? And then he says, up to 7 times, feeling very magnanimous, feeling very kind and merciful, should I forgive my brother who sins against me 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you, forgive him 7 times, but forgive him 7 times 70. Now, this is a remarkable thing that's happening here, because if a 7 is a Sabbath cycle, and if 7 sevens is a larger Jubilee cycle, then what would 70 sevens be? It would be like a Jubilee on steroids, right? Something is going to happen at the end of the 70 sevens that will announce not just the land returning to its ancestral owners in a temporal sense, not just the canceling of debts in an economic sense, not just the slaves being set free in, again, an economic sense. Something else would happen at the end of the 70 sevens. Jesus here anticipates it, and he speaks it to Peter. So Jesus here is referring to an ancient prophecy in the book of Daniel about the Messiah. When Rome was just out here a few moments ago, he was speaking about this exact prophecy that I'm talking about. You might remember when he said to his wife, have you read this? Have you read this? I don't do a very good role. Hey, have you read this? This is amazing. Okay? That's my best Rome. I just need a deeper voice and bigger biceps. So Jesus here is referring to a prophecy that looks like this, okay? Now, this is just the brief overview of the prophecy, but what you have is a remarkable prophecy found in the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. It begins in 457 BC with a decree from a king, a Persian king, and it moves all the way forward through 69 weeks, and that 69 weeks brings us to AD 27, the very year that Jesus became Messiah, the year he was baptized. Halfway through that year, halfway through that week, that final 70th 7, or that 490th 7, halfway through it, Jesus dies on the cross. And then another 3.5 years after that, this really remarkable thing happens, and I don't have time to get into right now. The point is this. This prophecy anticipates, with like laser-like accuracy, that Jesus would come right on time. Which is why when we go to the Gospels, we find Jesus saying things like this. Now, after John was put in prison, that's John the Baptist, Jesus came to Galilee preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God and saying, the time is, what's the word, everyone? Time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. Another New Testament writer, the Apostle Paul, picked up on this very notion. But when the right time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves. Again, not merely in an economic sense. This isn't just 7 sevens. This was 70 sevens. That Jesus, the Messiah, would come at the culmination of Israel's history, and not just temporal debts, but true debts, debts to God, not just the land in a general sense, but the land, the earth, would be restored to its natural and ancestral state, that it would be given back to the children of men. And so one of Jesus' favorite things that he would say in the Gospel of John is, if the Son sets you free, you will be free. What's the next word? Indeed. Free indeed. Jesus not only died, he rose from the dead. And really, everything boils down to that. I mean, that's the bottom line. If Jesus rose from the grave, then he is who he claimed to be. If he did not rise from the grave, then he is not who he claimed to be and who Christians say that he is. Luke chapter 24 says, then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And he said this to them, thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem, and you are witnesses of these things. In addition to the sabbatical cycles, there's another fascinating little Christmas prophecy I'll throw out at you real quick. Israel's calendar, their festal calendar, was made up of 6 feasts, 3 in the spring and 3 in the fall. And each of these festival events, actually anticipates some significant event in the life of Messiah. Jesus was Passover when he died. He rose from the dead and became the first fruits. Then at the end of the Feast of Weeks was what was called the Day of Pentecost. This brought about the fall feast, or the autumnal feasts, which begins with the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and culminating in the Feast of Booths. In a very significant sense, the spring feasts are really easy to get your mind around, but in a very significant sense, all of these feasts are fulfilled in a profound and powerful way in the very life of Jesus. So we could say it like this: Israel's festal calendar and their astonishing history prophetically anticipated the Messiah, Jesus. It's not just a guess, Stoner said. It's not just a chance. Maybe somebody randomly happened into these prophecies, fell into these prophecies. Stoner said the chances are astronomically, infinitesimally small. No way it could have happened. And so Israel's, not only their calendar, but their astonishing history, these sabbatical cycles and these messianic prophecies anticipated prophetically the Messiah Jesus. Contained right in that slide is what we're talking about here, PropheticA. And I invite you to see the Christmas prophecies through new eyes, through the very same eyes that Matthew saw them through, so that you can say, with me and with Matthew, it was fulfilled in Jesus.
Thank you, David.
Thank
Just
you.
have a few questions here for you, hot off the press.
Great.
First of all, do Jewish scholars recognize these Old Testament messianic prophecies as messianic and yet to be filled, since they don't believe Jesus was the Messiah?
Well, the question is actually fundamentally mistaken, because it's saying that, and I'm not making a big case here. I'm just saying Jewish scholars, there are many Messianic Jewish scholars. I have friends that are Jews and believers in Jesus. So it's a bit of it's not exactly accurate to say the Jews deny it. There are many Jews that believe that Jesus is the Messiah. It's kind of a funny question, because it's like saying, do people that don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah think that these prophecies point to Jesus as the Messiah? Well, the answer to that would be no. But do the Jewish people who have looked at these prophecies, and especially these sabbatical cycles, culminating in Daniel chapter 9, there are many Jews. In fact, I have a friend, Dr. Alan Reineck, who is a Jew, and he came to faith through study of Daniel chapter 9. So yes, there are, and it's right down, I mean, there's going to be people who are non-Jewish who will find it persuasive, and there's going to be people who are non-Jewish who find it unpersuasive. There'll be people who are Jewish who don't find it persuasive, and those that do. So, great question.
Is there something that you would like people hearing what you've shared about today to do about it? Is there an application that you want to just drive home again?
Man, I think you should accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and live the life that God has intended for you. Yeah, absolutely. If you need more information on that, just come talk to me. I'll tell you how to do it. But I guess the short version would be, a really great place to start would be to pick up the Bible, pick up the book of Matthew. And this is a little experiment that I like to do. It's a challenge I've given to people all over the world. Pick up the Bible, start with the book of Matthew, and just read a chapter a day and just bask in the description of this guy Jesus. Just let it soak into your soul and ask yourself this question: has there ever been a person like this? And the answer for many of us, many millions of us, is no. In fact, I go so far as to say that the remarkable account of Jesus in the Gospels, and just start with the Gospel of Matthew, there are 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that the story is so profound, so uninventable, that it could not have been made up. It's a story that no one would have written. In this really great book called Church History in Plain Language, the author Bruce Shelley opens this really remarkable book with this line. He says, Christianity is the only major world religion to have as its central event the humiliation of its God. Well, that raises a question. Why is the central event of the Christian faith the humiliation of the Christian God? And the answer to that question is found in the fact that God, from a Christian perspective, reigns not in power. He reigns in love and in service and in humility. And all of that is embodied in this guy named Jesus, who is uninventable. So my invitation to you is to read the Gospel of Matthew. Ask yourself, what about this guy? What do I think about him? And if you come to the same conclusion that I and many millions of others have, then just ask him into your heart and ask him to be not just an historical figure, but to be your personal Savior.
Would you thank David Asscherick? He will be back. Thank you. Now I'm pleased to invite another musical item, this time from Sandra Interman. Please make her feel welcome.
Mary, did you know that your baby boy would someday walk on water? Mary, did you know that your baby boy would save our sons and daughters? Did you know that your baby boy has come to make you new? This child that you've delivered would soon deliver you. Mary, did you know that your baby boy would give sight to a blind man? Mary, did you know that your baby boy would calm a storm with his hand? Did you know that your baby boy has walked where angels trod? When you kiss your little baby, you've kissed the face of God. The blind will see, the deaf will hear, and the dead will live again. The lame will leap, the dumb will speak, praises to the Lamb. Mary, did you know that your baby boy is Lord of all creation? Mary, did you know that your baby boy will one day rule the nations? Did you know that your baby boy is heaven's perfect lamb? The sleeping child you're holding is the great I am. Mary, did you know?
Thank you, Sandra. So appropriate. What a perfect way to finish the afternoon session. I've just got a few things I need to mention to you. To those of you who have purchased tickets for the VIP dinner, which is the hottest ticket in town, totally sold out though, I'd better tell you where it's happening. So I think we've got a slide on that. It's about 100 meters away, 153 Margaret Street. Go out the front of the building here, right for me, I guess, down to Margaret Street, otherwise known as Eat Street by the locals here, and you'll see the restaurant Fitzy's on the far side of Margaret, And the dinner will be happening in the Tapestry Room. Just remember that, which is the closest to the street front. All right, now remember that the booths will be open from 6:30 this evening, and then the movie premieres 7 p.m. sharp. And I should note, this is not a feature-length film. It's a cutting-edge documentary, which is shorter. So we should be done around 8 p.m. Some people have been wondering if they'll be out until 9 or 10 at night. But no, we should be finished with the film by 8 p.m. tonight. And now for my final announcement, and I'll invite our lights to come up. I can't really even believe that I'm doing this. Tomorrow, we are going to... Are you sure you want to do this? See, I'm not in charge. I'm just the pretty face. And so I'm going to go ahead and make this announcement. We are going to offer free entry for this PropheticA weekend for everybody, anybody, for the entire day tomorrow. So if you know someone that you think would be encouraged or challenged or inspired by what you've heard today, invite them, pick them up, text them, but no scalping your tickets. You cannot on-sell your tickets. We do this for the kingdom, and we do it because we would love for more people to be mindful and aware of some of the things that we've been talking about. So I hope that you take that in the right spirit, and we do appreciate, of course, your investment to be here. All right. At this point now, we will have a dinner break. I think that's everything. We'll look forward to seeing you back here, 6:30 in the booths, and then 7 o'clock sharp in here for the film. Thank you.